Imagine this. It's 2 in the morning. Not 10 p.m. with fireflies and porch lights twinkling. Not midnight with the faint sound of crickets. No, this is deep into the dead zone of night. The kind of hour when only raccoons, insomniacs, and bad decisions roam free. And out of the darkness comes the unmistakable rumble of diesel engines. Not one, not two, 7 charter buses. Now, unless you live next door to a university football stadium, there is no earthly reason why 7 buses should ever roll into a quiet Texas suburb. Yet, there they were, lined up like an invading army, headlights blazing across freshly mulched flower beds. The hiss of air brakes shattered the stillness. Doors swung open, and the invasion began. Wave after wave of college kids stumbling out, eyes glazed, cups in hand, ready to turn someone else's property into their personal music festival. 300 students. 300. To put that into perspective, that's more people than most small-town city council meetings, high school assemblies, or Friday night diners could handle. And every single one of them had been funneled directly onto the lawn, the vegetable beds, and, this part hurts, the memorial rose garden planted in honor of Tank's late wife. Now, let's pause for a moment. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night because the neighbor's dog barked too loud? Or because some teenagers thought fireworks in July were a good idea? Annoying, right? Now multiply that by 300. Imagine the crunch of irrigation pipes snapping under drunken footsteps, the slosh of beer spilling into carefully watered soil, and the horrific sight of roses meant to honor a loved one being trampled under sneakers sticky with tequila shots. And then there's HOA President Vivien Ashworth Klein, our villainess of the evening, standing there in her designer robe directing this chaos like some suburban orchestra conductor. She didn't just allow the destruction, she choreographed it, pointing, waving, instructing college kids exactly where to stomp, like she was auditioning for the role of evil step queen of the cul-de-sac. Her PS to resistance? Pointing straight at Sarah's roses, Tank's late wife's roses, and telling them to really trash that flower area. Let that sink in. These weren't just plants. They were living symbols of a marriage cut short by cancer, reminders of love and memory woven into the soil itself. And this HOA Karen turned them into target practice. That's not petty. That's not a neighborhood spat. That's cruelty with a garden hose on top. Now, here's where it gets cinematic. Picture Tank, retired Marine Logistics Officer, call sign Tank for a reason, watching this entire invasion unfold from behind his kitchen window. The man had survived Fallujah, endured desert heat, and navigated hostile supply lines. Yet nothing in his military career could have prepared him for the sight of 300 drunk college kids rampaging through his therapy garden while his HOA president cackled in the moonlight. What would you have done? Seriously, drop it in the comments. Would you have charged out there like a one-man SWAT team? Called the cops immediately? Or maybe, just maybe, grabbed a lawn chair, sat on the porch, and documented every single second for future evidence? Because that's exactly what Tank did. He didn't rush, he didn't scream, he documented. And in that moment, while Vivien thought she was orchestrating the perfect act of revenge, Tank was silently gathering the ammunition that would blow her empire to smithereens. And let's be honest here. If this were a movie, this would be the cold open. The scene that leaves audiences gasping, whispering, "Wait, did that just happen?" It's the HOA Wars equivalent of the Red Wedding. Brutal, unexpected, and the beginning of a downfall so spectacular it deserves its own Netflix limited series. So let's recap fact 1. 7 buses, 300 drunk strangers, roses destroyed, and an HOA president who mistook her clipboard for a battle flag. That's not just violating community trust, it's a declaration of war. And if you thought this was the peak of insanity, Oh no, my friend. This was just the prelude. Because if you think buses full of party kids were bad, wait until you hear what she fined him for. Spoiler, it's red, round, and goes great in a salad.
All right. So, after surviving the midnight invasion of 300 drunk students who thought Tank's vegetable garden was Burning Man, you'd think the neighborhood's HOA president, Vivien Ashworth Klein, might have calmed down. Maybe she'd take a spa day, reevaluate her life choices, and realize that unleashing chaos on a Marine veteran's property wasn't exactly her smartest move. But nope. Instead of dialing back, she decided to double down with something so absurd, so petty, it could only come from the HOA rulebook. Finding a man for planting tomatoes. Yes, tomatoes. You heard that right. Not a massive commercial farm, not some illegal cannabis grow operation, just tomatoes. Bright red, juicy, cheerful little orbs of therapy that Tank was growing to keep his PTSD in check and his pantry colorful. To most of us, that's called gardening. But to Vivien, it was apparently a federal offense, punishable by certified mail and a $75 fine. The notice landed like a slap in the face. Official HOA letterhead, stiff legalese, and the accusation spelled out in bureaucratic perfection. Violation for non-decorative plant species visible from the public right-of-way. Non-decorative plant species. Let's pause on that. Apparently, in the world of HOA Karens, flowers are acceptable, bushes are fine, and even a topiary shaped like a poodle passes inspection. But tomatoes? Absolutely not. Because nothing screams decline in property value like the possibility that your neighbor might make a BLT with fresh ingredients. Now, Tank could have ignored it. He could have paid the $75, chalked it up to HOA nonsense, and gone back to watering his plants. But let's be honest. This is a Marine we're talking about. Marines don't retreat because of tomatoes. They dig in. They strategize. They build a case. And that's exactly what Tank did. He marched himself down to the courthouse, not once, but for days, pulling deed records, property surveys, and HOA covenants that most people don't even know exist. And what did he find? Gold. His property predated HOA's 2019 covenant amendments, which meant he was grandfathered in and completely exempt from their ridiculous decorative plans-only nonsense. Translation, his tomatoes were legally untouchable. Now, here's where the story takes a beautiful turn. Instead of firing back with angry emails or shouting matches on the street, like most HOA fights devolve into, Tank responded with pure, unshakable professionalism. He drafted a calm, respectful letter, attached copies of his deed, covenants, and proof of exemption. No swearing, no sarcasm, no drama. Just military-grade precision with receipts. And here's the thing. Most people would have folded at that. They'd say, okay, I tried, I lost, time to move on. But Vivien? Oh no. Vivien was not about to let her ego lose to a man growing vegetables. Her eyebrows, meticulously microbladed and apparently calibrated to detect any sign of rebellion, launched into orbit when she read his reply. Because here's what Karens fear most: losing control. And this Marine had just outmaneuvered her using the very rules she loved to weaponize. Let's stop and ask you, the audience, what would you do if your HOA fined you for tomatoes? Would you laugh it off and pay the $75? Would you fight it with paperwork? Or would you go nuclear and start planting zucchinis, cucumbers, and pumpkins just to watch the HOA implode? Drop your answers in the comments because I have a sneaking suspicion most of you wouldn't stop at tomatoes. Back to our story. Vivien realized she'd been checkmated, but instead of conceding, she did what all petty dictators do. She escalated. Tank may have won the tomato battle, but Vivien was already plotting the HOA war.
She started doubling her surveillance runs past his house, clipboard in hand like she was leading a military reconnaissance mission. Certified letters started stacking up in his mailbox faster than Amazon Prime deliveries. And her obsession with his garden turned into something out of a suburban Cold War thriller. But this tomato find, this was the spark. It was the moment Tank realized he wasn't just dealing with a picky neighbor, he was dealing with a tyrant in tennis shoes. It wasn't about tomatoes, it wasn't about property values, it wasn't even about aesthetics. It was about power. And Vivien was willing to burn the whole neighborhood down to prove she had it. So, let's recap fact 2. Tank was fined $75 for tomatoes. He fought back with ironclad legal proof that he was exempt. He won the battle. But in doing so, he exposed Vivien's greatest weakness, her need to control at all costs. And once you see the crack in a dictator's armor, you know exactly where to aim your next shot. Because if you thought a $75 tomato fine was ridiculous, just wait until you hear what happened when Karen spent her weekend measuring his fence, his garden, and probably the air he was breathing, resulting in 14 violations in one envelope.
So, after tomatoes became public enemy number 1 and Vivien Ashworth Klein, our reigning HOA overlord, lost that skirmish, you think she might have taken the weekend off to sip some boxed wine and rethink her life choices. But oh no, this wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about ego. And when a Karen's ego takes a hit, the whole neighborhood better buckle up because she's about to go nuclear with her clipboard. Here's what happened next. Tank opens his mailbox one crisp Monday morning, probably expecting a bill or maybe a flyer for 2-for-1 pizza night at Domino's. Instead, he finds an envelope fat enough to qualify as a small novel. Inside, 14 violations. Not 1, not 2, 14 in one weekend. Let that sink in. Most people get an HOA violation maybe once every few years if they let the grass get too long or forget to bring in the trash can. But 14? That's not enforcement, that's obsession. That's Vivien sitting in her Prius with a flashlight and a ruler, patrolling the cul-de-sac like she's auditioning for CSI Suburbia. And the violations themselves? Oh, they were gems. Unauthorized fence height, improper edging along garden beds, excessive water usage. One even claimed that his lawn gnome, yes, a single lawn gnome, violated the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Imagine having so much free time and so little joy in your soul that you start waging more on ceramic lawn ornaments. The fine stacked up to $1,100. $1,100, all because Vivien weaponized the rulebook like it was her personal holy scripture. At this point, it wasn't about tomatoes, fences, or water hoses. It was about breaking Tank down, making him quit, and reminding the whole neighborhood who the real sheriff of Suburbia was. But here's the thing Vivien forgot. Tank wasn't some random pushover. This man was a retired Marine. He'd survived desert heat, incoming mortar fire, and bureaucratic nightmares that would make the DMV look efficient. You don't rattle a Marine with paperwork, you just give him a new mission. So, Tank did what Marines do best. He went tactical. He laid out each violation on his kitchen table like they were enemy dossiers. He measured his fence. He cross-referenced water bills. He photographed every inch of his property. If Vivien thought she could drown him in paperwork, she forgot that Marines are basically born with filing cabinets in their brains. Now, let's pause and ask you, the audience, what's the worst HOA nitpick you've ever heard of? Was it the guy fined for leaving his trash can out for 20 extra minutes? Or the family told their Christmas lights were too festive? Drop it in the comments because I want to know how your neighborhood Karens compared to this 14 violation circus. Back to the action. Each violation Vivien threw at Tank turned into an opportunity for him to expose her incompetence. The fence height? Legal. The water usage? Normal. The lawn gnome? Okay, maybe a little tacky, but definitely not against the rules. And the cherry on top? Several of her complaints directly contradicted each other. She accused him of excessive watering and insufficient lawn hydration in the same packet.
That's like telling someone they failed the driving test for going too slow and too fast at the same time. By this point, the neighbors had started to notice. People who once rolled their eyes at HOA meetings were suddenly leaning in, whispering to each other at block parties. 14 violations for one man? Even the most by-the-book homeowners started thinking Vivien had gone off the rails. And here's where it gets really good. Vivien didn't realize that every complaint she filed, every fine she mailed, was building Tank's case against her. He wasn't just fighting back, he was collecting evidence. Photos, letters, dates, times, witness statements. To Vivien, it was harassment. To Tank, it was documentation. And documentation is the one thing that can turn a petty HOA battle into a full-blown legal smackdown. So let's recap fact 3. In one weekend, Tank racked up 14 HOA violations totaling $1,100 in fines. It was petty, it was ridiculous, and it exposed Vivien's obsession for what it was, an unhinged campaign to break him. But instead of cracking, Tank stayed calm, collected his evidence, and got ready for the counterstrike. Because if you think 14 violations was Vivien's checkmate, you've got another thing coming. Tank was about to flip the board, expose her own dirty laundry, and show the entire neighborhood that this HOA queen had been breaking her own rules all along. All right, so up to this point, Vivien Ashworth Klein, our self-appointed dictator of the cul-de-sac, had been hammering Tank with fines, violations, and enough certified mail to keep the post office in business for the next decade. 14 violations in a single weekend, remember? She thought she had him boxed in, suffocated under paperwork, cornered like a cat toy dangling in front of an over-caffeinated tabby. But here's the problem with going to war against a Marine. You're not the only one who knows how to play offense. Tank decided it was time to stop just defending himself and start launching a counterattack. And oh boy, was this counterattack glorious. See, Vivien had spent months, years even, portraying herself as the perfect suburban queen, the HOA's iron-fisted ruler, the one who protected property values while sipping Chardonnay and clutching her pearls at the sight of lawn gnomes. But the thing about rulers is the higher they build their pedestals, the harder they fall when someone shakes it. And Tank was about to shake it like an earthquake. Tank did what Marines do best, recon. He started digging, and not with a shovel this time, but with public records, permit filings, county zoning laws, HOA meeting minutes. He spent hours combing through the fine print, the kind of stuff that would make most people's eyes glaze over faster than a Hallmark movie marathon. But for Tank, this was his battlefield, and just like that, he struck gold. First discovery? Vivien's deck. Oh yes, her fancy, Instagram-worthy deck where she probably hosted wine tastings and plotted neighborhood domination. Totally illegal. She had expanded it without HOA approval and worse, without city permits. In HOA terms, that's like catching the sheriff robbing the bank. Second discovery, her husband's business. Turns out Mr. Klein was running a full-blown operation out of their home, something explicitly forbidden in the HOA covenants. We're not talking a few side hustles on Etsy. This was full-on customers coming in and out, deliveries stacked on the curb, the whole 9 yards. Illegal as all get out. Third discovery, her pond. Yes, Vivien had a decorative koi pond, the crown jewel of her curated lawn. The problem, half of it wasn't even on her property. It extended onto HOA common land. Translation? The woman who fined Tank $75 for tomatoes was trespassing with goldfish. You can't make this stuff up. Now imagine Tank's grin as he stacked these little nuggets of hypocrisy in a neat file folder. It must have felt like Christmas morning mixed with the satisfaction of perfectly folded laundry. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was locked, loaded, and ready to walk into the next HOA meeting like a one-man wrecking crew. And when that meeting came, oh, it was a masterpiece. Picture the scene. Fluorescent-lit community center, folding chairs lined up in neat rows. The smell of stale coffee wafting from a corner table. Neighbors shuffle in, some out of boredom, others out of curiosity. And there's Tank, folder in hand, posture straight, eyes locked on Vivien. The meeting begins, and Vivien, ever the tyrant, starts rattling off Tank's supposed violations. Fence this, water that, gnome over there. But then Tank clears his throat, stands up, and drops the hammer. With the calmness of a man who has rehearsed every line, he lays out his evidence. Illegal deck, unauthorized business, trespassing koi pond. One by one, he exposes her, each revelation hitting harder than the last. The room shifts. You know that moment when the crowd realizes the villain isn't untouchable? That slow murmur, that collective gasp, that delicious turning of the tide? That's what happened in that community center. Neighbors who once nodded along with Vivien's rants suddenly started whispering, side-eyeing, realizing that the emperor, or in this case the empress, had no clothes. Now, let me ask you this. If you were sitting in that meeting, watching the HOA queen get dethroned in real time, would you clap? Would you cheer? Or would you sit back, arms crossed, soaking in the delicious justice like it was the finale of your favorite drama series? Drop your answer in the comments because I'm betting most of you wouldn't stay silent. Back to the meeting, Vivien's face, her face. You could practically see the Botox straining to hold her forced smile as Tank dismantled her authority piece by piece. She sputtered, she deflected, she tried to regain control, but it was over. The receipts were too damning, the hypocrisy too obvious. For the first time, her neighbors saw her not as the protector of property values, but as the biggest violator of them all. So, let's recap Fact 4. Tank flipped the script. He dug into public records, uncovered Vivien's illegal deck, her husband's forbidden business, and her trespassing koi pond. He exposed her hypocrisy in front of the entire HOA, turning her carefully crafted image into a laughingstock. The queen wasn't just wounded, she was bleeding authority. And Tank, he was just getting started, because if exposing her dirty secrets in front of the HOA wasn't satisfying enough, wait until you hear what happened when Karen had to preside over her very own disciplinary hearing. Spoiler alert, she looked less like a queen and more like a defendant on trial. By now, Vivien Ashworth Klein had already gone from HOA queen to exposed hypocrite, thanks to Tank's recon mission that revealed her illegal deck, her husband's shady home business, and that koi pond trespassing onto HOA land. Her empire was cracking, and the neighbors had started whispering. But the real humiliation wasn't just in being exposed, it was in what came next. Vivien presiding over her very own disciplinary hearing. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine being the judge, jury, and executioner for years, handing out fines like candy on Halloween, only to suddenly find yourself sitting at the same table, facing charges you once dished out to everyone else. That's like the principal of a school getting called into detention with the students she suspended. The power dynamic flips, and suddenly the clipboard doesn't feel so mighty anymore. Here's how it went down. The HOA board, which Vivien once commanded with fear and passive-aggressive emails, had been pressured by Tank's evidence to hold a formal hearing. Rules are rules, and if Tank's tomatoes and gnomes had to be scrutinized, then so did Vivien's koi pond deck and entrepreneurial husband. There was no escaping it. The day of the hearing arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with curiosity. It wasn't just an HOA meeting anymore. It was the event. Neighbors showed up early, folding chairs filled quickly, and you could feel the tension in the air. Tank arrived cool, calm, collected, like a man showing up for a presentation he'd rehearsed 100 times. Meanwhile, Vivien looked like someone had spiked her Starbucks latte with lemon juice. She sat at the head of the table, visibly tense, her smile stretched thinner than the patience of anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA. The hearing opened with the usual formalities. Vivien, trying to maintain her aura of authority, banged the gavel and started reading through the agenda. But the irony was delicious. She was technically both the accused and the judge. And as the accusations rolled in, you could see her confidence crumble. Tank stood, laid out his evidence in military precision, and the room leaned in. Photos of the illegal deck, documents proving her husband's business violations, maps showing the koi pond trespass. Every piece was bulletproof. Neighbors murmured, nodding along, some even smirking at the poetic justice of it all. And Vivien, she tried everything. She downplayed, she deflected, she even tried to guilt the room, insisting her pond was aesthetic enrichment for the community and that her deck added value to the neighborhood. But you could tell no one was buying it. The same woman who once fined a man for tomatoes was now trying to argue that her rule-breaking was a gift to everyone. The hypocrisy was too thick to ignore. Now, let me ask you this. If you were sitting in that room, would you have spoken up, or would you have just enjoyed the spectacle, popcorn in hand, watching her squirm? Personally, I think I would have been in the back row whispering, "Order! Order in the court!" every time she tried to talk her way out of it. Back to the hearing. The board, which normally a rubber stamp extension of Vivien's authority, suddenly found themselves in a bind. The evidence was overwhelming. They couldn't just sweep it under the rug without looking corrupt themselves. So they actually started questioning Vivien, her deck, her permits, her husband's side hustle. And you could see it in her eyes, that slow realization that she wasn't untouchable anymore. Tank, of course, remained steady. He didn't gloat, didn't mock, didn't even raise his voice. That's the thing about Marines. They know the power of silence. He let the evidence speak for itself, and every time Vivien tried to dodge, it just made her look guiltier. By the end of the night, Vivien's armor of authority had shattered. The very board she once commanded had turned skeptical. Neighbors she once intimidated were now emboldened. And Tank? He walked out of that room with his head high, his case stronger than ever, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd turned the tables on the very person who thought she held all the cards. So let's recap fact 5. Vivien, the queen of fines and violations, ended up presiding over her very own disciplinary hearing. Tank presented airtight evidence, the neighbors watched her hypocrisy unravel in real time, and the HOA board could no longer ignore her abuses of power. It was the suburban equivalent of watching a dictator stand trial in her own palace. Delicious. But if you think Vivien learned her lesson after being publicly roasted in her own hearing, think again. Because next, she tried to weaponize city code enforcement against Tank. And spoiler alert, it backfired harder than a bad spray tan.
So far, Vivien Ashworth Klein had thrown every HOA weapon she could at Tank. Violations, fines, even her own disciplinary hearing. And each one backfired like a cheap firework in the rain. Most people, at this point, would have realized the universe was sending them a message. Sit down, stop, rethink your life choices. But not Vivien. Oh no, our HOA Karen decided to escalate again. If she couldn't take Tank down with HOA bylaws, she'd call in the big guns, city code enforcement. Now, city code enforcement is like the HOA's older cousin, who actually has some legal teeth. HOAs can send you angry letters and fines, but code enforcement, they can slap you with actual citations from the city. So Vivien picked up her phone, dialed the hotline, and filed a complaint that was so outrageous it deserves to be framed. She claimed Tank was running an agricultural business operation from his backyard. Yes, you heard that correctly. 6 tomato plants and a few cucumber vines, and suddenly Tank's property was the next Dole plantation. In Vivien's imagination, Tank was apparently supplying half the state of Texas with salsa ingredients. Forget that it was a therapy garden, forget that it was for personal use, Vivien spun it into some kind of black market vegetable empire. The city inspector showed up a few days later, clipboard in hand, probably expecting to find a massive greenhouse operation with migrant workers, forklifts, and maybe even a tractor parked in the driveway. Instead, he walked into a modest backyard garden, some raised beds, a few tomato cages, a man watering his plants with the same care most people reserve for their pets. Tank greeted him politely, offered to walk him through the garden, and explained that it wasn't a business. It was his therapy. He even showed him receipts. No sales, no customers, no transactions. Just a Marine growing food to keep his hands busy and his mind calm. And here's the kicker. The inspector wasn't just convinced, he was impressed.
He complimented the neat rows, the irrigation system, and the fact that everything was cleaner than most restaurant kitchens. He even joked that he wished more residents kept their yards this tidy. Meanwhile, Vivien was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, face frozen in that "I swear I'm right" expression that only Karens can master. But the inspector wasn't buying it. He filed his report. No violation, no agricultural business, case closed. In fact, his notes practically praised Tank's property as a model of upkeep, which means Vivien's attempt to weaponize city code enforcement not only failed, it backfired spectacularly, making Tank look even better on paper than before. Now, let me pause here and ask you, what would you do if your HOA president dragged the city into your personal business? Would you flip out? Would you lawyer up? Or would you do exactly what Tank did? Stay calm, let the truth speak, and watch the whole thing blow up in her face. Drop it in the comments, because I guarantee at least a few of you would have been tempted to plant even more tomatoes just to spite her. Back to the fallout. Vivien, of course, didn't take this well. In her mind, she was still the enforcer, the ruler, the woman who could bend the rules to her will. But the cracks were showing. First, the neighbors saw her hypocrisy at the disciplinary hearing. Now, the city inspector had essentially sided with Tank. Each failure chipped away at her authority, and the whispers around the neighborhood grew louder. Maybe Vivien's the problem, not Tank. And you know what? They were right. Because this wasn't just about vegetables or fences or ponds, this was about control. Vivien had built her entire identity on being the enforcer of the rules, the gatekeeper of suburban order. And when someone like Tank challenged her, she couldn't handle it. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, again and again, until even the city got tired of her nonsense. So let's recap fact 6. Vivien tried to weaponize city code enforcement against Tank by accusing him of running an agricultural business operation from his backyard. The inspector showed up, found nothing but a well-kept garden, and closed the case. Tank came out looking cleaner than ever, while Vivien looked desperate and unhinged. It was another spectacular backfire in a long line of backfires. But if you thought calling in city code enforcement was her final play, oh no. Vivien still had one last trick up her sleeve, and it was her boldest, most reckless move yet. She decided to weaponize the HOA's easement rules to unleash an all-out party invasion on Tank's land. 7 buses, 300 partiers, and chaos like you wouldn't believe. At this point, Vivien Ashworth Klein had exhausted just about every HOA weapon in her arsenal. She fined Tank for tomatoes. She slapped him with 14 violations in a single weekend. She presided over her own disciplinary hearing like a queen on trial. She even called in city code enforcement, only to get laughed out of her own complaint. Most people would have taken the hint and slunk away in embarrassment, but not Vivien. No, Vivien decided to level up her madness. If paperwork, fines, and inspectors couldn't break Tank, maybe chaos could. And that's when she came up with what has to be the most insane HOA retaliation strategy of all time. She weaponized a community event loophole and sent 7 full buses of drunk partiers directly onto Tank's land. Yes, 7 buses. Not a block party, not a cookout, not a few guests sipping punch by the pool. 7 massive charter buses packed with 300 screaming college kids rolling into a quiet neighborhood like an invading army on spring break. Imagine the ground shaking, headlights blazing, music blasting from Bluetooth speakers before anyone even stepped off. It was less community appreciation and more Coachella HOA edition. Now, here's how Vivien pulled it off. The HOA had a clause in its bylaws that allowed common easement areas to be used for neighborhood gatherings. Normally, this meant small events, picnics, neighborhood cleanups, maybe a holiday potluck. But Vivien twisted that clause into her own personal nuke. She filed the paperwork for a so-called community appreciation event, But instead of a wholesome gathering, she basically invited half the local university to party on Tank's property. The sight was surreal. Imagine Tank's rose garden, his carefully planted vegetable beds, his memorial fountain, all suddenly swarmed by hundreds of strangers who had zero respect for the place. Beer cans were flying, music was thumping, and people were trampling his lawn like it was a mosh pit. It looked less like a neighborhood event and more like the opening scene of a college comedy movie. And where was Vivien? Oh, she was there, standing proudly at the edge of the chaos, arms folded, smug grin plastered across her face, clipboard in hand like she had just orchestrated the Suburban version of D-Day. In her mind, this was victory. This was how she'd finally break Tank, by flooding his sanctuary with enough chaos to make him snap. But here's the thing Vivien didn't realize. Marines don't snap under pressure. They plan. They adapt. They wait for their enemies to overextend. And Vivien? She had just overextended harder than anyone in HOA history. Tank didn't yell. He didn't charge into the crowd. He didn't even call the cops immediately. Instead, he documented. Cameras on, audio running, witnesses ready. Every stomp on his roses, every crushed tomato plant, every shattered sprinkler head, recorded in crisp, unforgiving detail. What Vivien thought was her ultimate move was actually Tank's golden ticket, because when the dust settled, he had all the evidence he needed to not only defend himself, but to bring her entire operation crashing down. Now, here's a question throwing your way. If 300 drunk strangers suddenly invaded your yard at 2 a.m., what would you do? Would you lose it and start yelling? Would you grab the garden hose and turn it into a riot control weapon? Or would you do what Tank did? Stay calm, document everything, and let your enemy dig her own grave? Drop your answer in the comments, because I know some of you are thinking about the hose option right now. The aftermath of that night was pure destruction. Lawn torn up, roses stomped flat, sprinkler system destroyed, trash everywhere. It wasn't just a violation of HOA rules. It was an outright assault on Tank's home and memories. And Vivien, she thought she'd won. She thought this spectacle proved she was untouchable. But what she didn't realize was this stunt was the exact thing Tank needed to move the battle from HOA squabbles to the courtroom. So, let's recap fact 7. Vivien manipulated the HOA's easement rules to justify throwing a so-called community appreciation event on Tank's land. But instead of lemonade and lawn chairs, she sent 7 charter buses of drunk college kids, turning his memorial garden into a disaster zone. It was reckless, it was cruel, and it was the beginning of the end. Because now Tank had undeniable proof of harassment, vandalism, and abuse of power. And if you thought this suburban rave was peak insanity, wait until you hear what Tank did next. He turned Vivien's so-called victory into the ultimate trap, documenting every detail and setting the stage for the legal takedown of the century. If you thought the 7-bus rave invasion was the climax, think again. Because while Vivien Ashworth Klein strutted around like she just pulled off the HOA heist of the century, Tank was already 3 moves ahead. This wasn't chaos to him, it was opportunity. Remember, Marines don't just react to battles, they set traps. And Vivien? She had just walked right into one so perfectly laid it could have been storyboarded in a military strategy manual. See, when those buses rolled up and the chaos exploded across his lawn, Tank didn't flinch, he didn't panic, he didn't even try to stop it. Instead, he flipped the switch on his cameras. Security system? Armed. Backup battery? Running. Extra footage? Stored in the cloud. Tank was documenting everything in full 4K clarity. Every stomp, every beer can, every broken rose petal. It was the suburban equivalent of drone surveillance in a combat zone. And he didn't stop at video. Tank had audio recordings. He had timestamps. He had a log of the exact moment each bus pulled in. He even had neighbors, fed up with Vivien's antics, willing to stand as witnesses. Imagine being so disliked in your community that when you try to destroy someone, half the neighborhood lines up to testify against you. That's the level Vivien had reached. Now picture the scene the next morning. The garden was wrecked, the lawn was trashed, sprinkler pipes snapped like twigs, roses flattened into the mud. For most people, this would have been the breaking point, the moment you throw your hands up, scream into the void, and start Googling cheap houses in another county. But for Tank, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. The trap was sprung and the evidence was airtight. Here's the beauty of it. Vivien thought she was humiliating Tank. In her mind, she had turned his home into a circus. But in reality, she had just handed him the keys to her downfall, because once that evidence hit the courtroom, no amount of HOA doublespeak or passive-aggressive bylaws could save her. Let me ask you this, because I'm curious. If you were in Tank's shoes, would you have stayed calm like he did? Or would you have marched outside and gone full Marine mode, yelling at the crowd, maybe even calling the cops right then and there? Be honest. Drop it in the comments, because personally, I don't know if I'd have had Tank's discipline. Watching drunk college kids smash my memorial garden, I'd have lost it. But Tank, he played the long game, and that's why he won. Back to the story. After the chaos, Tank didn't confront Vivien. He didn't even speak to her. He simply gathered his evidence, packaged it neatly, and prepared for the next phase, legal escalation. Because while Vivien was busy laughing about her victory, Tank was building a case so strong it would crush her in court. And here's the detail that makes this so poetic. Vivien herself had created the conditions of her own destruction. By filing the paperwork for the so-called community event, she left a paper trail that tied her directly to the damage. It wasn't like she could deny involvement. It was literally documented in HOA records with her signature. That's like robbing a bank and leaving your driver's license at the scene. Neighbors, too, had finally had enough. Some came forward to Tank with photos and videos of the chaos from their own phones. Others submitted written statements. It turned out Vivien's little stunt had not only backfired, it had unified the community against her. She wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the problem. So let's break this down. Fact 8 isn't just about the destruction of Tank's property. It's about strategy. Vivien thought she was dealing a knockout punch, but Tank turned it into a trap. He let the chaos happen, documented every detail, and built an evidence file thicker than a phone book. By the time he was done, he wasn't just a victim. He was holding the ultimate weapon, proof. So let's recap Fact 8. Tank didn't fight the party. He recorded it. He didn't yell. He documented. He didn't lose. It was Vivien who handed him everything he needed on a silver platter. What looked like her greatest triumph turned out to be her most catastrophic mistake. And you're going to want to hear what happens next, because all that evidence, it marched straight into the courtroom where a judge slammed Vivien with criminal charges so hard her clipboard practically snapped in half.
And now the stage was set. Months of harassment, fines, violations, tomatoes, and even a full-blown 7-bus invasion all led to this moment, the courtroom, the place where HOA power games lose their bite and real consequences finally land. Vivien Ashworth Klein, once the queen of the cul-de-sac, was about to face the one authority she couldn't bully with emails and clipboards, a judge. Tank walked into that courtroom like a man who knew he had already won. His evidence folder was thicker than a college textbook. He had video, audio, witness statements, receipts, HOA filings, and even the inspector's report clearing him of those ridiculous agricultural business accusations. If this were a poker game, Tank wasn't just holding a royal flush, he had 3 decks and Vivien had accidentally dealt them to him.
Vivien, on the other hand, looked less like a queen and more like a desperate sitcom character trying to talk her way out of a speeding ticket. She strutted in with her lawyer, armed with excuses, deflections, and that same smugness that had carried her through every HOA meeting. But there's one thing about courtrooms. Judges don't care about your smugness. They care about evidence. And Tank had evidence for days. The case opened with Tank's side laying out the saga: the harassment, the endless fines, the bogus violations, the tomatoes, the disciplinary hearing, the failed city code stunt, and finally the 7 buses community event that turned his memorial garden into a frat party wasteland. Every piece was backed by evidence. Videos played on the courtroom screen. Photos showed the wreckage. Witnesses described the chaos. It was a suburban horror story laid out in high definition. And the judge? Stone-faced, unimpressed, and clearly not amused by Vivien's antics. Each time Tank's lawyer presented a new piece of evidence, you could see the judge's eyebrow twitch just a little higher. By the time the footage of the buses rolled, you could practically feel the gavel vibrating in anticipation. Then it was Vivien's turn. And, oh, it was painful. She tried to spin it. She said the party was a legitimate HOA event. She claimed Tank exaggerated the damage. She even attempted the classic Karen defense. I was only following the rules. But remember, this is the same woman who built a deck without permits, ran koi ponds onto HOA land, and sicked city inspectors on tomatoes. Her credibility was already buried under a pile of her own hypocrisy. The judge wasn't having it. He interrupted her more than once, asking sharp questions. Where is the approval for this event? Why were 7 charter buses necessary? Did you authorize entry onto private property without consent? Each time, Vivien squirmed, stumbled, and tried to redirect, but the paper trail and video evidence were undeniable. She was cornered, and everyone in that room knew it. And then came the hammer. Criminal charges. The judge ruled Vivien guilty of harassment, criminal mischief, and abuse of authority. Her insurance company flat out refused to cover the damages, citing that her actions were intentional and malicious. Translation: every crushed rose, every broken pipe, every ounce of destruction was going to come out of her own designer handbag. On top of restitution, she got probation, a restraining order, and the kind of public humiliation that would follow her around longer than any HOA fine she had ever issued. Now, pause here and savor this. The woman who fined Tank for $75 for tomatoes was now cutting checks for thousands of dollars in restitution. The woman who tried to weaponize the HOA rulebook was now being told to stay 100 feet away from Tank's property by court order. The irony is so rich it could be bottled and sold as gourmet syrup. Now, audience time. Do you think Vivien deserved jail time, or was restitution and probation enough? Drop your verdict in the comments, because I know some of you would have loved to see her picking up trash on the side of the highway in an orange vest. Personally, I think the public humiliation might have been the harsher sentence, because nothing destroys a Karen like losing her audience. Back to the courtroom. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed like thunder. Vivien's reign was over. The smug grin she once wore at HOA meetings was gone, replaced with the pale, tight-lipped expression of someone who finally realized she wasn't untouchable. Tank, meanwhile, walked out not just victorious, but vindicated. He hadn't just defended his home, he had taken down the tyrant who made the neighborhood miserable for years. So, let's recap fact 9. Vivien went to court thinking she could spin her way out, but Tank's mountain of evidence crushed her. The judge slammed her with criminal charges, restitution, probation, and a restraining order. Her insurance company abandoned her, her reputation was ruined, and her HOA crown was officially shattered. But the story doesn't end with a courtroom slam. Because what happened next was even sweeter. The neighborhood rallied behind Tank, Vivien was forced to sell her house at a massive loss, and the community rewrote the rules in his honor.
So, Vivien Ashworth Klein had finally been smacked down in court. Criminal charges, restitution, probation, restraining order. Her clipboard crown had been shattered, her insurance bailed, and her reputation was shredded beyond repair. But the story didn't just end with a courtroom loss. Oh no, what came after was the cherry on top, the cinematic finale, the kind of neighborhood plot twist you can't script any better. The community uprising and Tank's rise as a legend. Let's rewind for a moment. For years, Vivien ruled the neighborhood through fear and fines. People kept their heads down, paid their penalties, trimmed their lawns to HOA-approved standards, and avoided confrontation. She thrived on silence and compliance. But after the trial, silence was no longer her weapon. She had lost the room, the board, and the neighborhood. And when an HOA tyrant loses the respect of her subjects, the whole kingdom collapses. Neighbors who once cowered under Vivien's gaze suddenly started speaking up. They rallied behind Tank, not just with words, but with actions. Within weeks of the trial, they organized to rebuild his memorial garden. Roses were replanted, mulch was laid, a new irrigation system was installed. And then came the finishing touch, a bronze plaque placed at the edge of the garden, inscribed in honor of Tank's late wife, and dedicated to all military families who sacrificed for their communities. What had been a site of destruction was transformed into a community monument. Think about how poetic that is. Vivien tried to destroy a memorial garden as an act of spite, and the end result was that the garden became bigger, stronger, and more meaningful than ever before. That's not just a win, that's a legacy. Meanwhile, Vivien's life went into a tailspin. The court's restitution orders gutted her finances. Her probation and restraining order meant she couldn't use the HOA like her personal sledgehammer anymore. And with her reputation in tatters, she was no longer welcome in the very neighborhood she once controlled. Word spread fast. Parents at local schools whispered. People avoided her at the grocery store. Her name became shorthand for everything wrong with power-hungry HOA boards. And then came the final blow, the for sale sign. Vivien had no choice but to sell her house, and because of her ruined reputation, no one wanted to pay market value for it. She ended up unloading it at a $75,000 loss. For someone who claimed she was protecting property values, that number must have stung worse than the gavel slamming down in court. Watching her move out with boxes piled high in the back of a U-Haul was like the closing shot of a reality show's season finale. The villain dethroned, the neighborhood free at last. Now here's the best part. The HOA itself underwent reforms. Inspired by Tank's battle, the community pushed through changes to the bylaws, stripping the board of unchecked power and instituting protections against harassment and abuse. They even nicknamed the new set of reforms Tank's Rules. Imagine that! A man who was once fined for tomatoes had now become the namesake of neighborhood justice. It's like going from being the underdog in a bad sitcom to having the stadium named after you. Let me ask you, the audience, have you ever seen a community completely flip on a power-hungry HOA? Do you think your neighbors would rally the way Tank's did, or would they stay quiet and hope the storm passes? Drop your thoughts in the comments because honestly, this is the kind of story that makes you wonder how much untapped unity is sitting under the surface of every neighborhood. So let's recap Fact 10. After Vivien's courtroom smackdown, the neighborhood rallied behind Tank, rebuilt his garden bigger and better, added a memorial plaque, and rewrote the HOA's rules in his honor. Vivien was forced to sell her house at a massive loss and slink out of town in disgrace. And Tank, he went from victim of harassment to community hero, a man whose fight against tyranny left a legacy that would outlast every fine, every violation, and every smug clipboard. And that, my friends, is how one Marine took on an HOA tyrant and won, not just for himself, but for his entire community.
And there you have it, the rise and fall of HOA Karen, Vivien Ashworth Klein. What started with a $75 tomato fine spiraled into one of the wildest suburban battles we've ever seen. Fines, violations, illegal decks, koi ponds, city inspectors, and finally, 7 buses of drunk college kids trampling a Marine veterans memorial garden. It was petty, it was outrageous, and it was almost unbelievable.
But here's the beauty of the story. Tank didn't just survive it. He won. He stayed calm, documented everything, and used Vivien's own arrogance as ammunition. In the end, she wasn't the enforcer. She was the criminal. The judge slammed her with charges, restitution, and a restraining order. She lost her crown, her reputation, and even her house. Meanwhile, Tank's neighbors rallied, rebuilt his garden, and rewrote the HOA's rules in his honor. That's not just a victory, that's legacy. And it leaves us with a bigger question. Why do so many HOAs, created to protect property values, end up turning into little dictatorships where power-hungry Karens run wild? Maybe the real lesson here is that communities don't need fear to thrive. They need fairness, accountability, and people willing to stand up when things go too far. So what do you think? Was justice served? Or should Vivien have faced even harsher punishment? And if this happened in your neighborhood, would you have stood with Tank or stayed silent? Let me know in the comments. If you loved this breakdown of HOA warfare, smash that like button, subscribe for more insane neighborhood battles, and share this with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA nightmare. Until next time, stay sharp, stay bold, and never let a Karen trample your roses.